Presence, the podcast for everyone interested in bodywork, embodiment, and somatic practices. I'm Andrew Rosenstock, your host and guide on this enlightening journey. With my expertise as a somatic movement therapist, yoga therapist, and certified rolfer, I'll merge clinical insight with real-world experience to enrich our discussions with our guests. Through engaging and informative talks, this podcast delves into mind-body paradigms, offering insights and strategies to empower personal growth. Your support is vital for our grassroots and lo-fi production. If you connect with our content, please leave a positive review and subscribe on your preferred platform. Your engagement helps us reach a broader audience and supports our mission. So thanks for tuning in today to Touching into Presence. Fasten your seatbelt as we embark on a journey to explore the transformative power of contemplative and somatic practices together. Today's conversation marks a departure from our usual format. Today I'm joined by Ryan Hofer and Paul Wirth. In mid-2023, Ryan organized a discussion among a small group of bodyworkers on the topic of embodiment, a conversation I found particularly enriching, especially as it introduced me to Paul for the first time. The depth and content of that conversation seemed too valuable not to share on the podcast. The original call included 4 or 5 participants, which, while enjoyable, might not translate as well into audio format for our listeners. A trio, however, makes for a more accessible listening experience. Paul, Ryan, and I share several overlapping interests, creating rich intersections of dialogue where two can engage deeply while the other listens in. My hope is to turn this into a semi-regular series with the both of them, discussing various topics as they arise and providing value to our community. This episode is the first realization of that vision. Ryan Hofer is fascinated by applications of body-based systems thinking and hands-on therapies. He graduated from the Dr. Ida P. Rolfe Institute and was the chair of a structural integration certification exam program. He has completed a Master's of Teaching and a Master's of Communication, and he is currently pursuing a doctorate in naturopathic medicine. Paul Wirth is a bodyworker and movement educator, a certified advanced rolfer, and a student and teacher of Tai Chi Chuan. His practice integrates structural integration, craniosacral therapy, visceral manipulation, and various kinds of movement work. A guiding question for Paul is, how does a person's innate capacity for healing make use of my presence and input, and what about that is up to me? He endeavors to continually be surprised by the reality that each person he works with is a living present being, and to undertake practices that remind him that he is too. So it's a really rich talk that's full of a lot of different topics that I really enjoyed, and I hope you do as well. And as I said, this will be the first of hopefully a few. We have another one scheduled, actually the day after this one will be released, and we'll see how it rolls from there. Anyways, with that, let's hop into the talk.
Hey, the gang's all here.
Hey, good to see you guys.
Good to see you, Paul.
Sound okay? I hope this isn't too late for you.
Yeah. No, it's fine. No, it's totally fine for me. I've a few things. One, I've had a long day, but like one of the things that I'm excited about was this call. I find, I don't know if this is similar with both of you. I find that processing what we do with other colleagues and dialogue a lot can be actually very, very healthy, very helpful. So even when I'm exhausted, sometimes just having a call with a colleague and talking about things or reframing or hearing other ways actually helps my nervous system really drop down.
Nice.
That's sort of one of the reasons I want to have this talk with the three of us. Is I really enjoyed the previous one, although there was 4 before, but I enjoyed the way that we kind of dialogue. And my sense was not just for us, but for other people. And this is one of the things I hear. One of the things I hear from feedback from the podcast is people saying, either way, wow, I'm not alone, or, something along the lines of I hadn't thought of it in that way, or oh, it's like there's something that people are getting that even though it might be other people having conversation, there's something beneficial to some others in that. And that's sort of the hope.
Definitely. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. I've definitely benefited from overhearing others or listening to your podcast. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm just getting over COVID, so I'm a little raspy. So
it's all right. So Paul, just before you hopped on, Ryan had asked about what is the format, or is there a format?
Do we need a format?
Yeah. I have some ideas on that, but I'd love to hear your ideas on that. Both of your ideas.
I can go first because I don't have any specific idea in mind, but I do have general things that I have been working with and thinking about in my practice. So, and I was sort of getting ready to just feel out the conversation and see what themes arise. But I'd love to hear if you guys have specific thoughts about what themes you want to talk about.
I think that's along lines of what I was thinking is just stuff that's front of mind, that's foregrounded right now for us. And it'll probably relate to embodiment stuff and therapies and society and what is it we're doing here. What is it like? What is this therapeutic space? I think that I've continually kind of fascinated and flummoxed by it, but at least I can kind of describe like, oh, that's why it's funny and quirky and weird, whether that be sort of historical context of like, well, how did we get here in this context in this year in the United States, or like, who are all these people out there doing all these different things that seem kind of related to what I'm interested in, but might be very, do they think they're doing the similar thing as what I'm kind of interested in, or do they see themselves as doing something quite different? Or, you know,
Ryan, real quick, without getting necessarily diving into the subject now, by other people doing different things, at what level of abstraction are you talking about? Other people within what field of work?
So let's say like maybe like a Feldenkrais teacher, or I think we were talking about continuum a little bit. Or we could do like craniosacral, or Alexander technique. Like, how do those, or you could even say somatic experiencing.
Like, and all the others that you have no clue about.
Yeah, right. And then that's just in the United States, like what I kind of know about, have come to know about. So, like I was just reading before I hopped on the call about bone setting in Russia, and how this craniosacral osteopathic practitioner thinks that it's very similar to osteopathy, and was kind of like, there's some sort of common ancestor there. So yeah, we just don't, so much it seems like I don't know where this stuff came from or where it's going. And maybe it's sort of, it's like, does it need a format? Does it, do we need an agenda here?
Oh, no. Yes.
Not in the call, but I mean like in all those arts, like moving through time and space. Is there a plan? Does there need to be a plan?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a small side project with a professor of philosophy, a retired professor of philosophy, and we're working on maybe writing some papers and stuff. And while we kind of we get into this bit of a disagreement where you're kind of always like, so what is the goal? And I'm always like, well, it's kind of a goalless goal. Like the more that we end up defining that goal, the more that isn't it. And yet here we are in this conversation trying to dance around it, because I don't, and this is what I love about these sort of conversations is I think the more that we do dance around it, the more it does get filled out. And what I loved about our last talk together was like, I think the three of us, this is why I think the three of us to me, it kind of reminds me of Sartre's No Exit, where you've got those three people in a room, and each of them have a little bit of the other, enough that they kind of play off of each other a little bit, for like this way of, well, we see it that way, but you see a little different. Oh, but me and you see it this. And so I like that fact that we can actually play on each other's strengths and weaknesses in various ways together, which is one of the reasons I did want to organize this call as a way of, again, growing out beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then to go with that. And so what is the structure? I think that's what we've all kind of said the same thing in different ways of the structure will kind of inform itself.
Mm. Yeah. It's, I mean, that it reminds you of the sort of, structure and function, mm-hmm. and this concept of, like, in embryology, like the function is needed so the structure emerges. Like, the blood needs to flow, so the heart forms, or the blood's already flowing, and so the heart forms to facilitate that and then strengthen that pattern. And so it's like function begets structure, begets function, begets structure. And I was reminded of that a little bit too when I was reading about how they make human organs, or they're learning to make human organ replacements. Is that the best way they found is to, I think, take the structure that's already there, like an animal heart, let's say, and wash out all those cells, but keep the structure, and then put human stem cells into it, because then they form a working heart. But they haven't figured out, like, they can't start with just one stem cell, right? And be like, you should make a heart now. So I think that's a really nice metaphor for, and getting into like the context and society, right? Are we kind of filling our little cellular function in a wider society? And Paul, like you were saying, I think I relate it to what you said about we're subtle creatures. We're picking up on stuff around us, but we don't know it very well. We don't know how to talk about it. We don't have time to talk about it. We don't have that much interest in talking about it sometimes. But is that what you're talking about, sort of with subtlety?
Yeah, this is the way my mind is wanting to respond to that is a little bit roundabout, but I'm just dwelling on the connective tissue matrix of the heart analogy that you described. That it's that matrix which is actually formed as part of a whole, all forming at once embryologically. That is important. I guess the reason I'm dwelling on that is that it seems like part of what you're talking about is parts versus whole, and techniques per se are parts. They're functional parts of working with a whole organism that's whole from the moment of conception onward. And since our minds work not exclusively, but they're fascinated with making divisions and parts, then we identify differences between techniques or modalities. And we also highlight what we can feel and what we can name as being operative. And those become hallmarks of the technique or the modality or the mode of perception. And, everybody's familiar with that general kind of line of thinking that we extract and extrapolate and distill, and we lose some measure of the whole. That's nothing new. I guess where subtlety comes in for me in that picture, one place it comes in that we to quote a good friend of mine, and I don't know if he's quoting, I think he may be quoting someone else, abstraction always does violence to reality. And that's another way of saying the same thing, a little more pithily. I guess one of the places where it does violence, or at least it does a disservice to reality, is the level of the subtle functioning of the organism, that the organism has. It may not have perfect powers of healing, depending on who you ask, but it's the only thing that is entirely itself. Your concepts about it are not it. It's entirely itself, and it's operating with, let's just say, perfect, just for the sake of the argument. Maybe it's not a wholly perfect, but it's more perfect than you and I can get. It's operating with perfect reference to itself. It's operating wholly as itself. We each are. So, and that goes down to, intracellular metabolic functions. So those things are subtle. The survival mechanisms of the organism are, extremely subtle, and they go from the macro to the micro to the nano. Once we have a named technique, it's always approximating expected functions of that organism. And if it can approximate them pretty well, or it's anticipating approximate functions of the organism. So if it can anticipate them pretty well, if I compress this bone here, if I push this here, now I'm interfacing in such a way that I ought to get such and such a response. If I've approximated that pretty well, then technique works. And the issue that I've had with how I came to think of my work early on as a structural integrator was I came to think of it as I do this to make something happen in the body. Maybe I change something, and the part of the trajectory for me and for many other practitioners as well, I think, is that it became at first parallel roads. Intellectually, I was recognizing and being taught, and in practice and perceptibly, I was also being led to become more and more convinced that what was happening was not that I was doing something. I was simply engaging intelligence, an intelligent, subtle response that was responding on its own terms and was going to respond more clearly the closer I was to having a correct appreciation for what it's doing at the moment and my role in that, and just an appreciation. I think there's no and. Just the more I was having an appreciation for its activity and its subtle responsiveness. Ooh, that was a mouthful. I didn't know I was going to get to the end of that. That's what I have to say so far.
Well, it actually ties into something I'd wanted to say earlier, which is when we were saying about, like, okay, so here we have this sort of formless structure, and we were all like, yes. So the reason I think that we can all have that formless structure is the safety within us and the safety of sense with others. So I feel safe enough that I can be with you too, and we can go into this thing and not get completely bamboozled, or even if we do, we'll figure out. There is a sense of safety, of comfort within that. And then sort of tying that into what you're saying, I see it as sort of the same, is that you're learning you learned first by doing to, and then over time learning how to do with. Well, to do with, doing to doesn't have the same level of safety because there's too much input being put in, too much correctiveness being this is how it should be. And doing with really starts to get out of the sense that me, the practitioner, really could do anything to this as you said, this like perfect mechanism. Of course, the perfect mechanism, and mechanism is not the right word. I don't want to bring in too much machinism, but for lack of sense, it's perfect. We'll say that it's perfect, as you said, but it's also it's perfect, assuming no real world events have happened to it. And as real world events come in, and that perfect adapts around them, sometimes it stays. And I mean, it's always perfect, like you said, although that idea of perfect, we have to shift. It's always doing the best it can. And yet sometimes it has had input come in that it is still adapting around, forming around, changing around. Information is, one is actually a two, and there's confusion or whatnot, or feedback loops. But as I'm hearing it, you had said the word about correct, and I think I agree with you so much, but I want to change that word, that correctness, to a clearness. That there's a clear, because there really, I don't think there can be a correctness to this, because as soon as we go into correct, we're back into that dualistic framework, and so while language is going to be somewhat limiting here, but I hear you. I think it's really that as you get more clear to this phenomenological being in front of you, and how the more clear you are to it, but also the more clear you are with yourself, and the more present you are, which again partly comes out of that safety of I can just be here. The less you have to do, and the more that actually unfolds.
Yeah, clearness is a word I've thought of to describe partially what I want, but the sense of like, what am I expecting, right? What am I expecting to feel in my body? What's a successful workout, meditation, body work session? What do I expect to feel? And I almost want, like, I kind of wish Scientology, I think it's Scientology, they call it going clear. There's that Netflix documentary about Scientology. And I was like, dang, like, I wish that they hadn't taken that phrase, because that's kind of how I would describe like what I want. Yeah, I want to like go clear. Or I want to be in clarity. I want to be in the clear for some experiential amount of time, because it doesn't last. Those highs and lows don't last. But something remains in that, where it's like you remember those experiences in some way. You might have metaphors for them. I remember feeling during it was like a Baral visceral manipulation session. I remember feeling, it was so weird, because I felt nausea and joy at the same time, simultaneously. I was like, that is so crazy. In that session, as sort of your organs are kind of moving around in your intestines. And I just don't think in the course of everyday life you would get these experiences, but they provide some learning and some sort of clarity. And I think that's one thing that really fascinates me about hands-on body-based therapies, is that there's some kind of education happening that I can't find anywhere else. Like there's some sort of context there that's very unique in modern society. And I'm very interested in learning like Andrew, your interview with Don Hanlon Johnson, when he was talking about like what's good for learning, how do you set up a good learning environment, and I think that's part of the puzzle and part of the addressing the subtlety is setting up a learning environment that the operator or the practitioner or the sort of educator at the time is comfortable in and proficient enough in to kind of invite in someone else's structure and function and have it be an edifying experience of learning, that's not like kind of overly corrective kind of or like kind of wrist slapping, like some of the recordings, a few of the recordings that I've heard of Ida Rolf not quite getting there for me on as far as the learning theory part. It seems a little bit like kind of slightly stern Socratic method, and that there's kind of like a right answer that people should be getting towards, in contrast to, let's say, like a session where it's like or a class where it's kind of like, well, everybody feel what you want to feel, and then we observe, and then we talk about it. And wow, you felt that, but I felt that. I think those are kind of maybe two poles of the spectrum. But yeah, I have no summation of that, but I kind of got lost in my own journey. So maybe you guys can summarize what you think you're hearing.
Well, I'm hearing the two poles. I think that was a worthwhile addition there. That like, if somebody wants to impart something, if Ida Rolf had a kind of experience and way of perceiving, sensing, and determining where to work with a body that she was trying to impart. So she and any teacher needs to, people are there to have that imparted to them. They're there to get, okay, it's this direction, not that direction, is where the little nugget that I'm missing is. So I think there's a place for correction. In some email or phone conversation with one or both of you before, the subject of correctness came up before. I think it was an email, and I was thinking, I haven't looked up the etymology, but I'm taking an educated guess that as much as correction does have connotations of right and wrong and slapping on the wrist, I think its etymological roots would be coming into alignment with rect meaning straight or in line, and together, straight together. And in that sense, there's room for correction. Without correction, you don't get to make the distinctions between. You don't get to make useful distinctions in the real world. But I do really appreciate the point about teaching, and I think it is parallel with some of the stuff I was verbosely trying to say earlier, in that I do best, and I think the best parts of my work arise from a feeling of co-participation in the unfolding of reality for that client and for myself, and the parts of what I inherited from Ida Ralph's teaching that really that continue to be alive for me are the ones that the client's body and my body show me and confirm. And that confirmation from the body and from sensing and from functional responses in me and in the client, that's something that I think different teachers evoke more or less. And the getting to your point of the other pole, the other side of the coin, if you really, just as in a session when you're working with a client, so in teaching when you're working with a student or being a student, if the client and or the student can be led to recognize something that's already there in a new way in themselves, it's going to take root.
Mm-hmm.
One more thing to add to that. Sorry. I think just a little bookmark that I've been really thinking about the term or a phrase, self-recognition, or just recognition as being a real key to healing and to learning and to growing and to being more clear, that there's a kind of recognizing, just like when you recognize a friend who you thought was a stranger, or you recognize your own hand as being yours and not someone else's, or in psychotherapy, if a therapist helps you recognize something as yours and as a desire that you had or maybe had disowned, or a fear that you had and maybe disowned, suddenly you recognize it, you then grow. You're bigger now. Your consciousness and your life extends into that thing that hadn't been quite you. I think that happens on a cellular level too. I think so there's something about self-recognition that's important. That's a bookmark for that idea.
Mm. Would you have that be different than awareness, or would you use those two words sort of interchangeably there?
I definitely have awareness on my mind when I'm thinking about this. Yeah, but I'm loath to dive into it too much because I can't define awareness, and I'm kind of skeptical of anybody who thinks they can. But just on everyday use of the word awareness, consciousness, and the self-recognition idea feel very related. Yeah, but I wouldn't venture to try to define it.
Yeah, less about big A, more that as you recognize something, you're becoming more aware, right? So it's like maybe not for you. For me, those words have a similarity of, So like one of my clients will say to me a lot, I love how you help me see what's in front of me the whole time that I had not seen prior. Right. So she's recognizing it, but she's also now more aware of that. And so I'm just trying to figure out, partly also what is the difference, but is that yeah,
definitely. Yeah. I don't mean to quibble too much, but I get fascinated with these things. And then,
but that's partly why I want to be in conversation. Is I want to quibble. I want to sit in those and I think a lot of other people do. But we won't do it for now. One of my hopes. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, just one thought that comes up is, does in recognition, does awareness grow, or is awareness
I think yes.
The field in which the recognition happens. Yeah.
Right. I feel you on that. It's good.
I don't know if we have more, or we can, it's a manner of speaking, but
it is. I mean, My concern, my one of my sort of concerns with recognition, to go etymologically, is it's to recognize, it's to rethink, and that a part of this is more than cognition, and so the cognition can be important for sure. It very much is, and it's just it's a part of it, and I know that you know that because everything you're saying is about prior to that cognition. Mm-hmm. And I think that some of it is the cognition, and some of it is this other. So I mean, when Ryan was talking about what he's looking to feel, what I was coming up with was, and this is something I'm doing in my own practice, is changing feeling into, and you actually said this, Paul, into sensing. So what can I sense? Because if I go to feeling, although the word can be used different ways, I am talking about one of my senses. But if I go into sensing, then I'm in this more rich landscape of which they can also sort of swirl around. So the sense, for me at least, I have a bit of synesthesia in various things. Like I was talking with a client today, how a certain flavor tastes very yellow to me, and it has these connotations, which I actually find, I think that the more people get into this work, that can happen because a lot of these constructs and ideas start to shift, and we get more into this more of the sensing. But also, what is, and this will sort of tie into awareness, I hope, is what's under the senses. For me, I look at things more phenomenologically and saying, under the senses is the being. The being gets covered to the senses, which then goes up to cognition and creates this sort of world, which is important, as you mentioned before. But there is this other pole. Well, I don't know if it's another pole actually, but there is this other layer of the sensual world, which is, I think, what are you feeling when you're with someone? A part of it is thinking, but a part of the feeling is prior to the thought. It's the sensual. It's what I say is your nervous system sensing and first of all, feeling its own safety in response to this other and sensing the other person's. And while it might look like cognition, and some of it maybe, I think a lot of it isn't. I think a lot of it is just sensualness, beingness. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Love those points. I'm going to pause because I don't want to get too much further into it unless we want to pursue these. I want to hear a little from Ryan, but yeah.
Yeah. I want to just put one last point to tie that in, which is just that, if that is the case, how do you teach that? And that's what I've been struggling with. Mm-hmm. How do you teach that? I don't know.
Yeah. This is good because I was thinking how do you, what situations in modern life do we even get to be sensitive to ourselves and to other people around us? It's like we have to now contrive situations to do that. Mm-hmm. And even those are usually I'm going to drive in my car and go to here and be sensitive for a little while. And then,
but even you hit such a good point, sort of, is that what we're doing when people come to us, it is a contrived situation. Mm-hmm. That they are coming out of the real world to see us to go back into the real world. It's totally contrived.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's so cool because it's great, if we're going to contrive it, then let's do it really skillfully and let's do it really well. And let's have it be based on, things in the real world or the rest of the person's life or the rest of the student's life. Let's contrive a really nourishing educational learning experience for people, because I don't know, to me, that just, it's not, that concept frees me up to tinker with things and kind of be creative in creating that context, because that's how I conceive of kind of what's going on, is you're kind of arranging a container for learning, and to still be available and like aware of what the person's coming in with and like where they're at, because the person might not really need what you thought you needed to teach them. And so how do you be sensitive to that and aware of that? And I've been thinking a lot, Paul, about what we were talking about with fluidity and what is the reality? Let's sort of what are the kind of qualities of this nervous system, and like what allows for that subtlety, and what allows for someone to like jump into a situation for like an hour or like 90 minutes, let's say, like even like what we're doing here, or whether it's a class or a session. Like it's pretty wild that an individual can jump into that, do the thing, like be in the container, and then kind of go on with the rest of, they can even like have, sort of the rest of their day and jump back into their life. And maybe that's not always the case. Maybe some people actually say like, wow, that was so amazing that it made me realize I wanted to change my life drastically. Which is possible. But yeah, I've just been thinking a lot about fluidity. And what were we talking about, Paul, where it's like some things feel dried out. It feels like things don't move, right? They feel dried out. Like, and to me, that's the sort of the letdown of kind of the structure philosophy, like the bones and the fascia, like you're moving those and you're doing things to those. And to me, it's like, no, those change through fluidity. Those get healthier through fluidity. It's exchange. It's this novelty coming in and different and patterns flowing out, or maybe a pattern that allows for an exchange of things coming in and coming out. And to me, that has something to do with sensitivity, that we're like able to let that happen while still kind of directing it a little bit based on our own skill set and our own comfort level. So yeah, that just comes to mind. I've been thinking a lot about fluidity.
I'm hearing like at least two, levels in terms of a figurative level and a literal level. That, figuratively, I grok what you're saying with fluidity as a as a characteristic, or as a figurative, in a figurative sense, fluidity as a plasticity, changeability, possibly intelligence, adaptability, and I think one of the, in reference to the sort of dried out, desiccated kind of idea as a metaphor, with work in general, body work in general, structural integration specifically, it has been and can be, in my experience, kind of dried out. That, you're not, figuratively speaking, again, you're working with technique. This is looping back to previous parts of this conversation that we've been having, but like we can loop back to rigid forms and structures that aren't necessarily respecting or in a that aren't necessarily in a dance with the intelligent activity or the plastic fluid activity and responsiveness of the body. That's how I interpret that part of that so the work and the teaching can get dried out and stuck in doing, like you said, Andrew, or doing too. But then also there's the literal level too, which is curious for me because, like from the biodynamic or the osteopathic point of view, as far as I understand it, there's a huge amount of interest and respect for the fluids themselves and them, their activity, literal fluids, being intelligent or directed by intelligent responsiveness, and that, and in that sense too, historically, structural integration has been dried out, literally, in the sense of not really teaching students to sense the wet, living, pulsating fluid, whatever it is, 60 to 75% water, depending on who you're talking to, body. So we're sort of going back to your heart analogy. We're often taught to be pushing the heart connective tissue around, directing that and expecting the heart cells, speaking figuratively, to then follow that. We get so stuck on structure and connective tissue that we don't remember to loop it back into the whole continuum that it's part of. And we often, I'm speaking like strictly SI in a strict sense of particular kind of perspective that not everybody shares. But with that in mind, or with that caveat, we can get stuck in a very narrow and somewhat dried out form of structure that's fascial, and forget that fascial is, we forget that connective tissue includes the blood and includes like the tiniest gossamer touch that may affect the just fibers between skin and the layers underneath.
Yeah, because I always think about like I kind of think of like chiropractic as like pretty far on like a spectrum, because to me it's like, okay, I can feel that this bone is in this position, so then I'll do this technique and then the bone will be in alignment, it'll be in a better position. But that doesn't often last, and it's quite like outward boom intervention, and that's not fluid to me, even though maybe you get some sort of better circulation immediately after and like an endorphin rush type of experience, but it's taking fluidity kind of as like a baseline body characteristic would lead you down a different path. And I think some people come to that, right? They're like, well, if I'm holding the bone, it can untwist, right, in some way. So, it's not that the bone is like, it just seems so like seductive and to think of like, oh, I can feel that this bone is out of place, so I'm going to put it in place. I learned how crack, and that also seems like too easy a shortcut that doesn't last.
It's also, it goes back into it's parts, not whole.
Yeah.
It's part thinking that, oh, if I put this part in, it is the whole, but it's not a very wide range whole. It doesn't take in the other functions of the whole. It takes in the minimalistic whole that I can currently see, and therefore it must be the whole. But I want to go back just a bit to what Paul was saying about SI dried out, and both agree and not agree at the same time, because that's just what I do. Because a few things. One is it's some parts are dried out because some parts are still clinging on to 40 years ago and saying we're going to teach the same. So clearly, so much has changed that they're like holding on to an old story is going to dry out. But I don't know if either of you are Rolf movement people, if you study Rolf movement, especially with like Kevin and Karen and the tonic function way of looking. Because for me, that I mean, even I think Kevin and Karen's book they wrote, Kevin Frank, Karen McCose, I think their book is called How Life Moves Through You or How Life Flows. I forget the exact name. I have on the shelf over there. Their SI, it's all about fluidity. It's all about movement. And there are a lot of, I mean, not a lot, but there are a fair amount of biodynamic Rolfers, I being one of them.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is SI. And it's not, to me, it's not dried out. It is, yeah, I don't have a better metaphor to play with it, but it's very fluid and it's very alive. And but yes, I also recognize that the main culture of SI is, I probably shouldn't say the main, because I don't know, a large part of it is dried out, is very do this and do that, even if they might not think that. I think from a biodynamic perspective they are, but I realize that's maybe my own ego speaking. It does seem like a fair amount is less, maybe less process oriented and more like, even when I learned the 10 series, part of it was, memorizing from looking at pictures that somebody drew, and basically, and it's a good way of learning. Like, I mean, if it is what it's saying, that you have to learn the recipe in order to forget the recipe, then like that is in some way a good way of learning. But it wasn't fluid. I was parroting. My first few years, I had really no fucking idea what I was doing. Probably damaged a lot of people and thought I was effing amazing.
Yeah, I want to just, I agree with you. And I also want to clarify, when I was, as I'm hearing you talk, I can clarify it better. I have no way of quantifying how many or who or what portion of the SI community or teaching is one way or another. I think probably closer to the internal experience, or the past experience I was referring to, was more that sense of history. And you brought up your training, so the culture in terms of what training is, and what we're taught, and what we tend as a culture of practitioners to think we know, and possibly do know, about the past and the history of this work. This is very subjective on my part. So, stop me if you disagree. But my subjective sense has always been that the story is that it's like a tree. The trunk of the tree, Ida Rolf's teaching was fairly a transitive verb. I, Rolf, you. And we do something to beautifully evoke something else to arise in the body. In her case, spoken of as the line. But the language and the teaching and the old school techniques, there's that old school idea of old school Rolfing. There's just a kind of sense of, okay, well, that's the trunk of the tree. And then maybe even the majority of us are doing many different branches or many different related things that both adapt from or vary or are variations on that, or put a different spin on what's happening in that structural fascial core trunk of the tree thing. So that's just my subjective sense, is that we have this sort of idea that's the sort of foundation that or the theme that we're creating or implementing variations on. And it's significant for me because it brings up a lot of questions, both about how this stuff was taught to me and how it ought to be taught. And it also brings up some questions about what, if that's the foundation or that's the trunk, what's the trunk of the trunk? In other words, as you and I were having a conversation, Ryan, like I think we were, another way of saying it is we were talking about teaching and we were talking about pedagogy, and what I found myself saying, or I think we were sharing perspectives on this. I want to ask myself, and when I share with somebody who's a practitioner or a new practitioner, or teach, rather than teach them what I'd have taught, I would want them to start to ask, what were her questions? And
right. Yeah.
So there's a foundation underneath the foundation. Yeah.
It is talked about a bit. And I think like Jeff Birch did a decent amount of research on that, sort of looking at how the 10 series was originally a 7 series, and how she sort of came to be. Although you're right, now that I kind of think about it, there still is something missing in that for me. So I just really appreciate you, Paul. I appreciate how you phrase things, how you word stuff, and how you get me to think in different ways. There is something of sort of, well, what was the seed in there? Like, what was the actual? Because they always say that she was into metaphysics, but like, I don't know how much of that we hear, like a little bit because of Korzybski and Good Chief. I think she was a little bit into. I'm not really a fan of either of those, but yeah. What where we hear that story that Ida Rolf was all upset because somebody said she's only working on the body, and she said it's all that she could touch. Well, what more? Like, how else was she? How was she touching with her? Sight is a touch at a distance. How was we don't really? I don't know a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like I don't know that I learned how to ask questions like that, like in an embodied way, as far as like, I remember doing these exercises, we were evaluating like, well, what do you see? And it's like, okay, I don't know, at the beginning. And then you do start to develop seeing bodies in different ways. But, we never asked the question of, is the fluid flowing, which is kind of like the basic, maybe craniosacral evaluation, right? Is you're like, where is the wave diminished? And so, yeah, I think that's a really great way to phrase it. Is like, what is the question that sort of that fascial structural integration, are we asking it how can I get to this line, to this fabled line, or maybe how can I help this person feel more at home in their body? But then it sort of begs the question of, what's the route to get there? So how do I find that route at this time? How do I set up this environment? But it's like a continual puzzle to me of how different traditions, different practitioners label what they're doing. And like, maybe that's a good way to get under it, is like, tell me about the questions that you're asking, and trying to, what are you trying to answer? What are we trying to answer? And to me, it's very fascinating too, of how we ended up with our current set of answers in society. how did we end up with this, okay, if you have pain, here's a drug. You have mood problems, here's a drug, or talk therapy, is gained wide acceptance. But do you guys
now
think
it is, but it wasn't 30 years ago.
Yeah, I wonder if hands-on therapies will become popularized. I want them to, but
they are more. I mean, you hit a point earlier where you're talking about stuff in like the U.S. when we're talking about embodiment stuff. But remember in the 70s, if you were a massage practitioner, you were a prostitute or a gigolo. Like those were tied together for a while, at least culturally. Not really, but they were tied together. They were thought to be. They were similar in the U.S. But in Europe, massage was a part of life much more. So we, the three of us being in America or within a certain structure, our current structure of that society, will it become more normal? It does seem like it's becoming more okay. But just like my parents don't want to go to a therapist because they grew up in the time that talk therapy was deemed only for people who, had real issues. I think body work, I think it's a few things. I think one is it's coming out of that and it's becoming accepted and becoming, but there's this other, there's other counter side, which is the people recognizing or maybe not recognizing, but finding this previous way didn't work, and they're pendulating over to the extreme on the other side, of which there's this whole like when people come up to me and they say, yeah, I'm really into alternative medicine, and I try to say, this isn't alternative, it's complementary. Like we're not trying to be in this opposite, or we're trying to all work together. But for them, they're coming over and they're almost looking for this extreme opposite, because extremes are sexy, right? This isn't working, therefore this must be. And that, I think we've been seeing that in almost every, like whether it's Republican to Democrat, whether it's some sort of like racist sort of thing of we have to go to the extreme or the other. The extremes don't really work. We have to find the ways to bridge it into the middle. But that's a bit of a side thing to later go to culture. But I think for now, it's there is something about. I do think it's becoming more norm. I'm just not sure where that norm is coming from or what the reason is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that last thing, where the norm is coming from, gets back to the question, Ryan, you were saying, like just generally asking, what's the question that produced this norm? What are the frames of questioning of what's and the goals? I mean, I guess, yeah. What are the goals? But oftentimes the goals can be phrased in a question or are formed by a question. How can I make this person stop hurting? Or how can I raise this person's X, Y, or Z level of awareness or level of comfortability? Do I want, and then do we get to choose if we don't have to take somebody else's answers, but we also don't have to assume someone else's questions or guiding questions should be our own. I'm not certain that I want my guiding question to be that I want to contribute to the evolution of humankind. I don't know what that is, so that's not really a guiding question for me. Maybe liberation, yeah, but evolution, I'm not sure.
I think that's really cool to learn to ask your own questions. Like, academically, you study, you do like you go to all through K through 12 and then do bachelor's degree. And then like, I feel like maybe at the master's level, you're kind of like getting this awareness, or maybe end of bachelor's, like you're learning to ask the right questions. And I think like that's not only not the right questions, but you're learning to formulate questions that that result in different kinds of answers, new knowledge. And I think that might be a really cool framework to use, is like, by this, as you go on and you learn more, you're going to develop an ability to formulate a question and know when you've arrived at a satisfactory answer for yourself, and when it's time to move on to a different question, the next question. And I think it might be really useful for a group too. What question is this group asking collectively, and how are we addressing it?
The way I hear what you're saying, and I'm looking forward to Paul refining, because he's great at that with what I say. So I'm looking forward or ready for that. Is what I hear is it's critical thinking with a sense of, and I don't have a word for this, but for me, in my practice with people, when I hear, when I ask them sort of, what are you noticing? Or I gave them always open-ended questions. And when they kind of like hit on it for the first time, and I'm like, or they say something and I have them reframe it and they hit on it. And I say, well, what do you notice is the difference between those two answers? And they start to become aware of, there's a sense of knowing in the body. And so it's the sense of critical thinking, of asking the questions, and well, where are those questions coming from? Well, again, part of it is, I don't have a good word for this. I say it's still that safety in the body that provides enough that if I'm safe enough, I can actually use the ground to reach out more. If I'm not safe, I'm going to be pulling in to get stuff. But if I have safety, I can use that ground as a way to spring and to go around. And then as I kind of get the answer for now, right? Because there's no answer. It's just the answer for now. That makes most sense. I feel that, I don't have the same sense of constriction there. So there's something about this critical thinking ability, which is, I don't know how to teach critical thinking. I think it was taken out of schools years ago. But there something in that critical thinking, the ability to also start to, I don't like to say think outside the box. I don't think that makes any sense, because the box is your thinking. You can't think outside of your own thinking of your own box, but something within that. And then there's a sense to answer the next one. Well, how do we know when the question is done? Well, I don't know if the question is ever done, but it's done for now, with a sense of the breath, a sense of the body, a sense of here. That's my answer to it, which I don't actually still have an answer for.
I hear, well, I got all excited, Andrew, because you were like, Paul's going to distill this or something. So I got so excited about that, and thinking about how what you said might hit me, or how I might phrase it or categorize it, that I kind of lost track of the question Ryan asked, which was, what are the questions? So I'm going to stay losing track of that for a second and just say, one thing I heard in what you said, Andrew, was, although you were talking about critical thinking, for me, all the examples in the story you were telling was less about critical thinking as much as something a little bit more generalized, which I would term discernment. Discernment that may not be about thinking or critical thinking, but discerning in a variety of ways, perceptually, spatially, internally, based on feeling states, maybe thinking, maybe story based, but it's a discernment that then leads to some kind of knowing. And then an availability that's produced by that knowing. And that's very related to what comes up for me when I use this phrase self-recognition or recognition. Because you brought up the etymology, I just looked it up real quick. And of course, words are words. English words aren't French words, or certainly aren't Chinese words. So we can play around with words and add more importance to them than necessary. But according to Anim Online, the cognate part of it means to know, not necessarily cognition and thinking as we think of it. So knowing, and so it means knowing again. And in that sense, it feels very related to what you're talking about. There's a knowing. Like when I recognize somebody, it's not a cognitive, I'm thinking I know that person. It's, oh, there you are. Oh, hey. If I recognize, and so that, oh, I can use the ground to reach out and push off. One way of saying that feels true to me is that, and I think this maps onto Hubert Goddard and movement theory pretty well, but don't quote me on that. Is that when I'm functionally and structurally able to sense and utilize my relationship with the ground safely, in a way, it becomes part of my body. I recognize it, or at least I recognize that.
It's a body schema.
Ongoing. What's that?
It's more the body schema. I don't think it's become the body, but the body, the schema of it.
Body, yeah, sure, yeah, body. So that's better, yeah. But phenomenologically, for me, that feels like it doesn't feel separate from me. It's my body schema. The ground is part of it. In a sense, I've recognized it as my body world, which includes its context. There's a kind of, oh, there it is.
I want to refine, because I think that this is great. Is it, because for me, it would be separate from my body, but not separate from me necessarily.
Yeah, that's probably fair. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. The recognition, though, I don't want to belabor the word, because the more you use them, the more moot they come. But that feeling of recognition, or the appropriateness of that word for me, is where that's, that body schema and that being in relationship to is a non-dual experience. Yeah.
Sure. I want to see if you agree with this, for what you're saying, because I think you're right, and I think we agree. But anyways, is when I'm saying critical thinking, I think the critical thinking is needed to ask the questions. And I see like a funnel. I see like a funnel where it's like the critical thinking funnels into discernment, funnels into knowing, or felt. What I would say is not just knowing, but like the felt sense of knowledge, that being underneath it. But for me to answer Ryan's question is like, it's this sort of, and I don't know why I never think of funnels, but I kind of see that top layer being like, well, how we need this critical, we need to, and critical thinking, I think it's a bad rep. I don't see it, even the word critical gets a bad rep. I don't see it in that way as negative, although it can be used that way. And I think it became negative because people who were using critical thinking were asking questions, and people didn't enjoy that. And so it became, oh, you're negating. But critical thinking to me doesn't have any value of judgment of good or bad. It's like trying to understand stuff, making sense of it. Could it be this? Could it be this? Trying to break out of that box that we're in. So yeah, does that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that fits.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
I think about coming. Well, I don't know if this is totally the same thing. But okay, let me know what you think. But I find that observing contrasts results in questions, or I guess curiosities, kind of. But I think comparisons, I don't know, is critical thinking different than what the questions that arrives out of comparisons and contrasts, if that makes sense? Maybe because to me it's a little bit more like when I have like if you're looking at two texts in front of you or two pictures in front of you or two writing styles in front of you, it's like the contrast in me produces, I think if you do it long enough, which is not, it doesn't take too long, but I think that leads me to questions or an acknowledgement of like, here's some difference, here's some contrast. And then I might start asking questions like, what environment produced this? What environment produced this? In what ways do I feel like these have similarities? And in what ways are they really different? And that's, I think, one of the reasons I'm fascinated by different therapeutic approaches is because it's almost like comparative approach, comparative therapies. And not just saying that, like this one is off or doesn't do this, and this, but, and I think this is also in the scientific process. It's very useful to compare two things in a scientific study. Because then like you have something to kind of grasp onto and you can show them, different effects of at least, it's like, okay, at least I can observe the difference between these two things in this kind of wider, giant world context. And there's a bunch of stuff out there that I don't understand. Like, at least I feel like that's that ground that I can kind of push off of to explore things that I don't know, is to have those two or more different things. And so like that is the duality, kind of like that's the duality that gets me asking questions, in contrast to like sitting with one thing and kind of being like, this is so awesome and this is great, and not sort of, and also, but not really knowing if it's great compared to this, and this, and not really knowing like what questions I would even sort of ask about it. So yeah, I guess maybe that's my question, is like, is that critical thinking, or is it some other kind of mode of thinking, capacity to recognize difference between two things and to draw something from that, to draw a conclusion from that, or to draw knowledge from that?
I want to respond to that, but I don't want to get too hung up on the term critical thinking, or because I think I'll just say that for me, I guess the thinking part, critical and other, they're forms of discernment. They're cognitive forms of discernment. And and I think the discernment is always informed by something that we feel. I had only read a little bit of Eugene Gendlin, if that's how you pronounce his last name, but he's very.
I always thought it was Gendlin. Is Gendlin?
I don't know. Randomly pronounce it. Anyway, I've read only a little bit of him, but the sense that I get is that and what really struck me was how true it felt that, as I read some of his essays and things, that the process of thinking is a feeling process. I don't know if he said it, but it occurred to me, I find this really delightful, that when we say something makes sense, sometimes we forget it makes sense. We sense it. And
yeah, or the opposite. I say the opposite. I say the opposite a lot to my clients, that it's not that it's making sense; it's making logic, and that they're not able to get to the sense.
That's beautiful. I'm going to steal that from you.
Please. But if you steal something from me, I feel like that feels great.
Likewise. But so under this theme of discernment, it's fascinating. I mean, it's like I've been wondering, because I've been wondering if this is going to be something recorded and shared. Is anybody going to get anything out of this? I mean, we're really traversing various really interesting but not very immediately practical topics. I mean, they're practical particularly for people who have a particular way of thinking or a certain amount of experience, a certain kind of experience. But I'm wondering what people are going to get out of it. And I'm loving this. But one place where I feel like this theme of making distinctions is sort of the fabric of this conversation, because we started off asking, well, what are we going to talk about? What are the differences among different disciplines? That was some of your question, Ryan. What's in common? What's different? What's in common with between Ida Rolf's teaching as her initial students understood it, and someone who only does biodynamic craniosacral but was trained as a structural integrator or something? What are the similarities? What are the differences? What do they share? What don't they? I mean, it's like the age-old question about everything. That's what humans do, is try to, and it seems like we're all pointing towards that. This process of discernment is not only important for us in our thinking, in our decisions as people or as practitioners, but it's also something that's happening, that is happening in the physiology in the body, and the body and mind and the body schema and our functionality. That there's the discernment of the ground in a different way, discernment of my relationship of humerus to scapula, discernment of whatever, affords me a new opportunity. It affords me a choice. It affords me a question and choice. So the last little point on that, or the last little riff on that last point, is that I think we, and I personally, can get very hung up and have gotten very hung up on arguments, whether arguments I've inherited or arguments I've created in my mind about, let's say, in terms of practice, in terms of bodywork practice, this technique or that technique, this perspective or that perspective. And I'll put one up on a pedestal and put one way down below, or one just a little lower, consciously or unconsciously. I'll set them against each other. That's not to say that everything is equal and whatever happens, man. But there is this quality of argumentation between one perspective or another. And that's me trying to discern. Well, there's that, there's this, right? But it's kind of like when people are, talking about you and you're right there. In that case, I've got in my left hand this one perspective, and my right hand this other perspective, and they're like hand puppets. They're talking at each other, and in between is the light in which that which is to be discerned. The question is, what is the light in which we want to discern something, and why? Why are we trying to discern one thing versus another? And the body and an organism has a very good answer, which is whatever helps me be free, whatever helps me live another day. So I'm sorry, I'm talking so much, but I just want to say something about the context, that contextual, if I can frame the question, and a question is a form of eliciting discernment, if I can frame the question around something that matters, I'm going to be a lot happier, and I'm going to learn something. And especially if I can frame it around something that's going to help me answer it. And a living organism is always going to help you answer it because it has an answer. It has something it wants.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. What I'm going to say, if it's all right, just because we're approaching an hour and a half, and it's getting later in my time.
Oh yeah.
And I think the fact of the matter is the three of us could spend a lot of time here. And this is something I'm somewhat hoping to do is, you were saying, Paul, are people going to get stuff out of this? Well, the fact of the matter is we're not going to know until we do something. Right. But one of my hopes was I get a lot out of these. I believe people listening to will get stuff out of it. Not just practitioners. I have clients who will say, I really love that talk. It made me think in another way, which is great. It's another form of education. But I would want to have these, maybe, I don't know, I have a loose structure of maybe like every couple, 3 months, 4 months, whatever. We all have different lives. Maybe we touch back into subjects we didn't get into. Maybe something else is pressing at that time. But my sense is there's something here, and also the more we do it, it'll become more refined. It'll become more okay. We're in some way we're just figuring our footsteps right now. We don't know how to dance, and we haven't figured the tango out, and that may come. But there's another part of me that wants to go into discernment and critical thinking, because I think discernment's a part of critical thinking. But I also don't. This is the time and everything, and if we kept, we would be here. And already, I generally, when I do the podcast, I try to keep it an hour, because I think that how long will people hold on? But then again, some people say that I've had people say they love the 2-hour talks. They love that, and I'm thinking, why? I don't enjoy editing the 2-hour talks. I mean, it's like, oh, it's long.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of like both shorter podcasts, like the hours, and then just the long ones, man, where it's almost like just background, because I'll kind of like just go walking, or be doing something else and listening. So I think both have value. And the thing is, Paul, I'm going to go back and listen to this, because like I want to revisit some of the things that you've said. And I think that'd be so fun to come back.
A second listen.
Yeah. And I would love to come back in, let's say, like 3 months and talk again. Because I've gotten so much out of this conversation, and it's like, it feels like we kind of made some sort of progress, some sort of
I feel like we got the knife in the clam. And then we're like, okay, see you next time.
Speak for yourself. I'm like, this is a clam. I don't. What is this? Is this I don't even know what this is. I'm not even there yet.
You make me want to have some oysters when you say that.
Yeah, I'm getting hungry.
So yeah, I think it's all good, and just I'm trying to think back and kind of like summarize what was said and some highlights, and just that we are asking a question, and we are looking for discernment, and we gain discernment in our bodies, and we help clients reach discernment in their bodies. And to me, it says like, oh, once you have that contrast, then you gain more knowledge. Knowledge can come out of that, like the humerus scapula discernment then allows an availability for something new. And that, yeah, it's just really exciting for me. It's because it really freshens up a lot of my inquiries, and how it's like, well, okay, what question am I, how am I? And I liked what you said about the, what is the light in which we want to discern something, because that relates to me about contriving that environment for people. And, we generally don't, it's like, what's the atmosphere in the room that we're setting up in order to help to get to these questions. But then I think also we have to whether we're sensing that without words or just straight up asking people like, what's the question today? What question are you coming in with? Or like, maybe we'll find a question sometime during this session, and we'll find a discernment, not that we have to answer it sort of definitively, but that we will arrive at some discernment that your body and you, and even the practitioner, the teacher and the student will both have gained something from that. And that's so beautiful. And that's like, that's fresh, right? That's the fluid motion, right? That's not dried out, right? We're not just doing this act because you were told you had to do it that way. And that's sort of like what you said, like an inherited argument, right? Is that what we're doing with people sometimes?
That's a good phrase for it.
Yeah, we're just like rehashing the argument that a previous person sort of formulated, which can be something which might be useful sometimes to get into that, but also I really like that. Like, okay, what's the question for collectively, and then what's the question individually, and how can we share in the discernment that makes knowledge available?
Beautifully put.
I love it.
Yeah. Ryan, I'll share this and then we'll get off to say that I think this might relate. It's just potent for me. Is what I ask new clients the first day is, what are you here for? And then basically, in one way or another. And then the second question is, how will you know today that we're on that path? How will you know when we're done that we are not necessarily going to get there, but that something is bringing us closer to wherever it is you think you want to go? And I bring that back in throughout. All right, when they come back in, okay, what's going on, and what are we working with today, and then maybe bringing back the goal and allowing that goal to also, well, I came in for back pain, but actually after 4 sessions, I realized really blah, blah, blah. And so the goal shifts, and we're kind of going into that.
Yeah, totally. It reminds me of sort of like charting, and like, you're telling this story on the chart, but I think what you're saying is almost like something different, if somebody's like timeline or something, like what's the evolution and what's the shifting of those concerns and those questions, and
and how are they I'm coming in because I have back pain. Well, how will you know it'll be better? Well, like most people will say, well, I'll have less pain, and then maybe we go into a little bit because the way that I work, and I'm sure it's the same with the three of you and most of the side, when we're done, it doesn't look like anything it doesn't map up to what they think is supposed to be being done. And so that they can actually sometimes get upset. Well, you didn't do anything. And they say, well, how are you walking? Oh yeah, I feel better. Great. Can't you see? Now we're going back to what you said in the beginning. You wanted less pain. Is there less pain now? Yes. Cool. All right.
Yeah.
Is that,
Yeah. And maybe it's kind of like moving from, desiring the negative into, it's like that contrast too, but moving from desiring less of pain to recognizing more of health and that positive momentum moving forward. And I know that kind of gets into this whole, like, we don't do medical treatment, but okay. Well, next. We get into that. That's great. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Thanks for listening to us at Touching Into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Paul at mosaicbodywork.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate it if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast and subscribe to it through the platform of your choice. When you do this, it really helps other people find us, and we greatly appreciate your support. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching Into Presence. Goodbye for now.